I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Hey Patriot Warrior fam, I'm Face, and these are the histories that America forgot. The year was 1836, and the Texas Revolution raged on. General Sam Houston, Commander-in-Chief of the Texan Army, had been dealt a crushing defeat at the Battle of the Alamo just a few months prior. As he retreated deeper into the heart of Texas, his men weary and demoralized, he knew that he had to make a stand somewhere, somehow. His scouts reported that the Mexican army, under the command of General Santa Anna, was following close behind. They were drawing ever nearer to San Jacinto, a small river village nestled between the piney woods and the Gulf Coast. It was here that Houston decided to make his final stand. Houston knew that his army, while outnumbered and outgunned, possessed one crucial advantage: the elements of surprise. He had been using his rangers and scouts to gather intelligence on Santa Anna's movements, and he was confident that he knew exactly where the Mexican general would strike next. Houston laid a trap for Santa Anna, carefully concealing his troops in the thick underbrush along the river banks. As Santa Anna approached San Jacinto with his army, he received reports that the Texans were in full retreat. Confident of an easy victory, he ordered his men to press on. Little did he know that Houston's men were hiding in wait, ready to spring their deadly ambush. The battle began with a withering volley of gunfire from the Texan rifles, followed by a fierce charge from the mounted Texan cavalry. The Mexican army was caught completely off guard and quickly fell into disarray. Colonel Juan Almonte, a seasoned Mexican intelligence officer, arrived in Texas under the guise of a harmless government liaison. His true mission, however, was far more sinister: to infiltrate the colonist population and gather information that could be used to crush any potential uprisings against Mexican rule. Dressed in his finest silk cravats and tailored suits, Almonte cut an imposing figure as he made his way through the dusty streets of San Antonio, his boots clicking against the worn cobblestones, his dark eyes shadowed by a neatly trimmed mustache, surveying the bustling scene with a cold detachment. As the new director of colonization in Texas, Almonte was tasked with easing tensions between the Mexican government and the colonists, many of whom were growing increasingly restive under the rule of the central government in Mexico City. He delivered promises of self-governance and conveyed regrets that the Mexican Congress deemed Texas's request for separate statehood unconstitutional. Behind these words, however, lay a web of deceit and treachery that Almonte expertly wove. His true goal was to identify the local power brokers, infiltrate their networks, and gather intelligence that would ultimately crush any rebellion before it would gather steam. Over the course of this 9-month tour, through Texas in 1834, Almonte methodically mapped out the region, cataloging the population and their surroundings. He noted the strengths and weaknesses of their defenses, assessed their resources, and sized up the leaders of each settlement. His all-encompassing intelligence report would prove invaluable to Mexican military planners when the inevitable conflict erupted between the two sides. Yet as Almonte worked diligently to gather information, he also had to maintain the facade of a friendly diplomat, lest his true intentions be discovered and his mission jeopardized. According to Wikipedia, quote, "The area along Buffalo Bayou had many thick oak groves separated by marshes. This type of terrain was familiar to the Texians and quite alien to the Mexican soldiers. Houston's army, comprising of 800 men, reached Lynch's Ferry mid-morning on April 20th. Santa Anna's 700-man force arrived a few hours later. The Texians made camp in a wooded area along the bank of Buffalo Bayou. While the location provided good cover and helped hide their full strength, it also left the Texians no room for retreat. After the protests of several of his officers, Santa Anna chose to make camp in a vulnerable location, a plain near the San Jacinto River, bordered by woods on one side, marsh and lake on another. The two camps were approximately 500 yards apart, separated by a grassy area with a slight rise in the middle. Colonel Pedro Delgado later wrote that, quote, "The camping ground of His Excellency's selection was in all respects against military rules. Any youngster would have done better." End quote. Over the next several hours, two brief skirmishes occurred. Using the twin sisters, Texians won the first, forcing a small group of dragoons and the Mexican artillery to withdraw. Mexican dragoons then forced the Texian cavalry to withdraw. In the melee, Rusk, on foot to reload his rifle, was almost captured by Mexican soldiers, but was rescued by newly arrived Texian volunteer, Maribel B. Lamar. Over Houston's objections, many infantrymen rushed onto the field. As the Texian cavalry fell back, Lamar remained behind to rescue another Texian who had been thrown from his horse. Mexican officers, quote, reportedly applauded, end quote, his bravery. Houston was irate that the infantry had disobeyed his orders and given Santa Anna a better estimate of the strength. The men were equally upset that Houston had not allowed a full battle. Throughout the night, Mexican troops worked to fortify their camp, creating breastworks out of everything they could find, including saddles and brush. At 9 a.m. on April 21st, Cos arrived with 540 reinforcements, bringing the Mexican force to approximately 1,200 to 1,500 men, which outnumbered the Texian aggregate forces of approximately 800 men. Official count entering battle was reported at 783. General Cos's men were mostly raw recruits rather than experienced soldiers, and they had marched steadily for more than 24 hours with no rest and no food. As the morning wore on with no Texian attack, Mexican officers lowered their guard. By afternoon, Santa Anna had permitted Cos's men to sleep. His tired troops also took advantage of the time to rest, eat, and bathe. Not long after Cos arrived with reinforcements, General Houston ordered Smith to destroy Vince's Bridge, located about 8 miles from the Texian encampment, to block out the only road out of the Brazos, and thereby prevent any possibility of escape by Santa Anna. Houston describes how he arrayed the Texian force in preparation for battle. Quote, Colonel Edward Burleson was assigned the center. The 2nd Regiment, under the command of Colonel Sidney Sherman, formed the left wing of the army. The artillery, under the special command of Colonel George W. Hackley, Inspector General, was placed on the right of the 1st Regiment, and 4 companies under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Millard sustained the artillery on the right, and our cavalry, 61 in number, and commanded by Colonel Maribel B. Lamar, placed on our extreme right, composed our line. End quote. The Texian cavalry was first dispatched to the Mexican forces' far left, and the artillery advanced through the tall grass to within 200 yards of the Mexican breastworks. The Texian twin sisters fired at 4:30, beginning the battle. After a single volley, Texians broke rank and swarmed over the Mexican breastworks, yelling, quote, "Remember the Alamo, remember La Bahia," end quote, to engage in hand-to-hand combat. The Mexican soldiers were taken by surprise. Santa Anna, Castrillon, and Almonte yelled often conflicting orders, attempting to organize their men into some form of defense. The Texian infantry forces advanced without halt until they had possession of the woodland and the Mexican breastwork. The right wing of Burleson's and left wing of Millard's forces took possession of the breastwork. Within 18 minutes, Mexican soldiers abandoned their campsite and fled for their lives. The killing lasted for hours. Many Mexican soldiers retreated through the marsh to Peggy Lake. Texian riflemen stationed themselves on the bank and shot at anything that moved. Many Texian officers, including Houston and Rusk, attempted to stop the slaughter, but they were unable to gain control of the men, incensed and vengeful for the massacres of the Alamo and Goliad, while frightened Mexican infantry yelled, quote, "Me no Alamo," end quote, and begged for mercy to no avail. In what historian Davis calls, quote, "one of the most one-sided victories in history," end quote, 650 Mexican soldiers were killed, 208 were wounded, and 300 captured. 11 Texians were killed and mortally wounded, with 30 others, including Houston, wounded. Although Santa Anna's troops had been thoroughly vanquished, they did not represent the bulk of the Mexican army in Texas. An additional 4,000 troops remained under the commands of Urrea and General Vicente Filisola. Texians had won the battle because of mistakes made by Santa Anna, and Houston was well aware that his troops would have little hope of repeating their victory against Urrea or Filisola. As darkness fell, a large group of prisoners was led into camp. Houston initially mistook the group for Mexican reinforcements and reportedly shouted out that all was lost. Santa Anna had escaped towards Vince's Bridge. Finding the bridge destroyed, he hid in the marsh and was captured the following day wearing the uniform jacket of a private. This subterfuge was uncovered when other Mexican prisoners cried out in recognition of their commander. He was brought before Houston, who had been shot in the ankle and badly wounded. Texian soldiers gathered around, calling for the Mexican general's immediate execution. Bargaining for his life, Santa Anna suggested that he order the remaining Mexican troops to stay away. In a letter to Filisola, who was now the senior Mexican official in Texas, Santa Anna wrote that, quote, "Yesterday evening we had an unfortunate encounter," end quote, and ordered his troops to retreat to Bejar and await further instructions. Urrea urged Filisola to continue the campaign. He was confident that he could challenge the Texian troops. According to Hardin, quote, "Santa Anna had represented Mexico with one military disaster. Filisola did not want to risk another," end quote. Spring rains had ruined the ammunition and rendered the roads nearly impassable, with troops sinking to their knees in mud. The Mexican troops were soon out of food and began to fall ill from dysentery and other diseases. Their supply lines had broken down, leaving no hope of further reinforcements. Filisola later wrote, quote, "Had the enemy met us under these cruel circumstances, on the only road that was left, no alternative remained but to die or surrender at discretion," end quote. For several weeks after San Jacinto, Santa Anna continued to negotiate with Houston, Rusk, and with Burnett. Santa Anna suggested 2 treaties, a public version of promises made between the 2 countries, and a private version that included Santa Anna's agreements. The treaties Velasco required that all Mexican troops withdraw south of the Rio Grande and that all private property be respected and restored. Prisoners of war would be released unharmed, and Santa Anna would be given immediate passage to Veracruz. He secretly promised to persuade the Mexican Congress to acknowledge the Republic of Texas and to recognize the Rio Grande as the border between the 2 countries. When Urrea began marching south in mid-May, many families from San Patricio, who had supported the Mexican army, went with him. When Texian troops arrived in early June, they found only 20 families remaining. The area around San Patricio and Refugio suffered a, quote, "noticeable depopulation," end quote, in the Republic of Texas years. Although the treaty had specified that Urrea and Filisola would return any slaves that their armies had sheltered, Urrea refused to comply. Many former slaves followed the army to Mexico, where they would be free. By late May, the Mexican troops had crossed the Nueces. Filisola fully expected that the defeat was temporary and that a second campaign would be launched to retake Texas. When Mexican authorities received word of Santa Anna's defeat at San Jacinto, flags across the country were lowered to half-staff and draped in mourning. Denouncing any agreements signed by a prisoner, Mexican authorities refused to recognize the Republic of Texas. Filisola was derided for leading the retreat and was replaced by Urrea. Within months, Urrea gathered 6,000 troops in Matamoros, poised to reconquer Texas. His army was redirected to address continued Federalist rebellions in other regions. All the Mexican soldiers' bodies lay where they were killed for years or decades after the battle. Houston and Santa Anna both refused to order their soldiers to bury the dead, so they lay on the property of Margaret Peggy McCormick, who owned the land where the battle took place. Houston refused to bury the bodies because the Mexican cremated all of the executed fallen Texan soldiers at Goliad and the Alamo, and Santa Anna, for some unknown reason, refused to order his soldiers, now prisoners of war, to bury their fallen comrades. McCormick asked Houston in person to bury the now rotting Mexican corpses, but Houston simply responded that she should be honored, that her property is now the site of the battle that won Texan independence. Her family buried a few of the corpses, but hundreds of them were never located by them. Many years later, the corpses, now skulls and skeletons, were buried in a large trench on the battlefield site, but nobody knows to the present day where the mass burial site is located. Most in Texas assumed the Mexican army would return quickly. Such a large number of American volunteers flocked to the Texian army in the months after the victory at San Jacinto that the Texian government was unable to maintain an accurate list of enlistments. Out of caution, Béjar remained under martial law throughout 1836. Rusk ordered that all Tejanos in the area between the Guadalupe and Nueces rivers migrate either to East Texas or to Mexico. Some residents who refused to comply were forcibly removed. New American settlers moved in and used threats and legal maneuvering to take over the land once owned by Tejanos. Over the next several years, hundreds of Tejano families resettled in Mexico. For years, Mexican authorities used the reconquering of Texas as an excuse for implementing new taxes and making the army the budgetary priority of the impoverished nation. Only sporadic skirmishes resulted. Larger expeditions were postponed as military funding was consistently diverted to other rebellions, out of fear that those regions would ally with Texas and further fragment the country. The northern Mexican states, the focus of the Matamoros expedition, briefly launched an independent Republic of the Rio Grande in 1839. The same year, the Mexican Congress considered a law to declare it treasonous to speak positively of Texas. In June 1843, leaders of the two nations declared an armistice. On June 1, 1836, Santa Anna boarded a ship to travel back to Mexico. For the next 2 days, crowds of soldiers, many of whom had arrived that week from the United States, gathered to demand his execution. Lamar, recently promoted to Secretary of War, gave a speech insisting that, quote, "Mobs must not intimidate the government. We want no French Revolution in Texas," end quote. But on June 4th, soldiers seized Santa Anna and put him under military arrest. Burnett called for elections to ratify the Constitution and elect a Congress, the sixth set of leaders for Texas in a 12-month period. Voters overwhelmingly chose Houston the first president, ratified the Constitution drawn up by the Convention of 1836, and approved a resolution to request annexation to the United States. Houston issued an executive order sending Santa Anna to Washington, D.C., and from there he was sent home. During his absence, Santa Anna had been deposed. Upon his arrival, the Mexican press wasted no time in attacking him for his cruelty towards those executed at Goliad. In May 1837, Santa Anna requested an inquiry into the event. The judge determined the inquiry was only for fact-finding and took no action. Press attacks in both Mexico and the United States continued. Santa Anna was disgraced until the following year, when he became a hero of the Pastry War.
can hear the drums in the distance. I can feel the fear, the resistance. Everything can change in an instant. You might stay alive if you listen. Your best friend is your instincts, don't think. Trust me, everything can change in a blink. Hearts race, I can feel my heart pounding. Hold our heads up and this the chant we'll be shouting. This is war, you won't take me. This is war, you can't break me. It's just me, no saving. I'm the only one who can save me. So stand strong, stand tall, stay up, don't fall. Give it everything you got. No fears, no walls, just fight, no laws. Push yourself to the limit, just to fight for it all. I got fuel for days, it's a weapons that you can't stop, yeah, I won't think twice, either the end of me won't make it out alive. I got a full supply of energy and might you pick the wrong side, Here I go, taking every single blow to the dome, never slow, pushing through it cause you know that I chose to be known, legendary, I'ma show everybody in this battle that comes close, stay exposed, yeah. This is war, you won't take me. This is war, you can't break me. It's just me, no saving. I'm the only one who